Before we jump into our presentation for the week, are there any upcoming events or any announcements that anyone would like to share with the group that may be helpful for everyone? You can take a minute or so and do that, and then jump into Pete's presentation. If you are making an announcement right now, you have to unmute yourself. All right, we're going to jump into it then. Pete, I'm excited to have you present. I'm pumped to hear the presentation about the funding journey of a company and any other insight that you can share with the group about fundraising and your experience in that space. So I will, if you don't mind, just giving a brief introduction of yourself and then jumping into your presentation. We'll have Q&A and discussion afterwards. And if everyone wants to just start throwing questions into the chat while Pete's going through his presentation, I found that that works really well to kick Q&A off. But until then, Pete, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks very much. And it's really an honor to be here. I enjoy participating in these discussions. And so it's great to be on this side of it, getting to speak with all of you. So I'll give a quick summation of my background. So I come from an investment management background. I spent over 25 years as a professional investor, investing in a lot of technology companies and growth companies more generally, kind of across the full range of life cycle stages. And since moving to Utah about 2.5 years ago, I've really been focusing a lot of my time and effort on the entrepreneurial community through some affiliation and efforts towards organizations like Pando Labs. I'm a member and sit on the executive committee of Park City Angels. More recently, I've partnered with the Pivot Center at the U to serve as a mentor in residence. And I also have a consulting organization called Altivist Consulting that is really focused on supporting entrepreneurs and mapping out their growth journey, getting ready for interfacing with the investor community. And so it's great to be able to participate in an organization and a group like this. So what we're going to touch on today is talking about funding for your early stage enterprise and really trying to think philosophically about how to approach that and really how to contemplate the journey that you go through. This is obviously a huge topic, and so I'm going to try to keep it relatively philosophical and not go down the rabbit hole or too much into the weeds on some of the specifics, such as how to build out a cap table, the various minutia of term sheets and various vehicles. But I'm certainly happy to answer any questions when we get into that portion of it. So what I want to do is just, we want to kind of work through the progression. And so in setting the stage for contemplating going through a fundraising effort, first and foremost, I would say when you're contemplating pursuing funding, congratulations, because you must be at a point with your business where you're doing something right. You have developed a product, you have developed a solution or a service, and really assessed the product market fit and thought about how you're going to bring that to market to be at a point where you realize that we need to start generating some funding to continue to pursue the journey. Another important part of just setting that stage is really knowing yourself and knowing your business. It's incredibly critical as you start going through that journey and determining what it is that you need to fund the business and how you're going to go about doing that, knowing what you individually are bringing to the table, what your fellow co-founders are bringing to the table, but also you need to make sure that you're in a position where once you start pursuing that funding and interacting with potential investors, you're representing yourself as an expert in your product, your solution, and in your part of the market. You need to understand that better than anybody else and be able to convey that. One area that I think is important, and there's a little bit of difference of opinion on this, is I really think that you should be very well versed in budgeting, forecasting, understanding the existing and projected cash flow of your business. Some people say, hey, you don't need to do this at this stage of the business. I completely disagree, because I think that while a forecast at a very early stage is going to have a tremendous amount of variability, I like to say that the forecast that you put out there is kind of the one forecast that's guaranteed to be different from the reality. But it's a great exercise to understand what are the drivers of your company, where can your company get leverage with its go-to-market and its revenue model, and what are the limitations. You also really need to be mapping out what are the milestones that you are going to be achieving. If you are at an MVP stage for the company, then what is the next milestone in terms of achieving a certain level of traction with your customer base, or getting to a point where you need to expand your development efforts? Is there a level of intellectual property that you need to pursue? Really map out those milestones and understand, as part of your budgeting and forecasting, what it's going to cost you to get to that level. And then one thing that is incredibly important as we go through this discussion and contemplate any of the avenues for funding is just really owning the concept that no money is free money. There always is a trade-off in terms of what you're going to accept to be able to generate the capital to pursue the business. So starting out, looking at the nest egg for the very early stages of the business, that initial capital is incredibly sacred, and it's something that needs to be utilized very, very efficiently. This is not the time to be at all loose or splashy with the funding of the business. And I think the first part of where that nest egg comes from that is very important is you want to invest in yourself, quite literally. And obviously, as a founder of a business, you are putting blood, sweat, and tears into this. The hours, the late nights, the sacrifices, the all-in commitment. But I think it's very powerful if you can also put some of your own capital to work in the business. That shows a level of belief, a level of commitment, and that when you are looking for outside investment to go along with you, the fact that you're already there demonstrates a level of commitment and belief that simply sweat equity alone is not going to convey. This is also a time when the go-to tends to be friends and family capital. And this is definitely an appropriate early stage avenue to pursue, but I want you to be very cognizant of the fact that this can, in certain ways, be some of the most expensive capital that you raise, and that can be in the form of the impact that it can have on relationships. You need to be very selective in terms of who you are going to reach out to invest in your business at that stage, and making it very clear to them that so that they understand the likelihood of potential failure. You don't want to end up having, Uncle Joe who puts in his total nest egg to find out that 6 months down the road that ends up being a goose egg. And obviously at the early stages, that can be a risk. So you want to be very careful in terms of setting those expectations when you are raising money from friends and family, just due to the potential impact that that can have on relationships. And also at that early stage, it's never too early, in my view, to start really contemplating what you are going to do to share this opportunity with the team that is helping to build it. And I think that being very generous in terms of setting aside a pool of equity for your team, even if that team doesn't exist yet, certainly an equitable share of that among your co-founders is very important, because these are the individuals that are really going to help this entity achieve its potential. And you want to be able to share that and reward that. As I say, 100% of nothing is still nothing if you're so focused on the bear hug of equity that you don't share the wealth with your team. So bootstrapping is, I think, a great thing to initially focus on. and really trying to use what is available to you, to be efficient, to be lean in terms of getting the process of your company going. While we all hope that our business is going to be the next unicorn, you should work under the assumption that it's not going to be, and that you really need to be building more than just providing an idea if you're going to be able to raise capital. You want to show that you understand the mechanics of how to put the business together. You want to be working on a process and a roadmap towards profitability that you can demonstrate that you are doing everything that you can very efficiently to progress your business to a point where ideally it could be self-funding. But at the same time, bootstraps can break if you are really pulling on them too hard or for too long. And I think it's incredibly important that once you get that flywheel going, you don't end up starving the company simply to avoid giving up equity to outside investors. I've definitely seen this firsthand many times where businesses can be at a point where they've established a platform, they should be thinking about scaling, but they just don't want to give up that control or that feeling of control or sharing the equity or worrying about dilution. And so I think that it's important not to starve the business. Very important and closely related to that is understanding that during this bootstrapping phase, know what your team is carrying, the load that they are carrying on their backs. And at a time when you are trying to be very lean, everyone is tasked with wearing many hats. That can be a real burden on your team members, particularly your early hires. And so just, again, it comes back to that concept of generosity and sharing to make sure that you understand that during this phase that there's a very heavy load. It's also a time when you can start to cultivate some relationships with potential outside investors, but I would caution to be very selective on this. If you start generating interest in your business, it can be a deluge of investors who just want to get to know you a little bit better, spend a little bit of time with you, and that can be a very slippery slope. I think that you can be very selective in finding a couple of investors that you want to start cultivating that relationship, which could really pay off down the road once they see that you have been able to achieve some of the goals that you had set in those early stages. It gives them more confidence in investing in the phase of your business in working towards your next milestone. So when you get to a point where you start looking to going outside for external capital, I think a very important thing comes back to some of that background homework that you had been doing and have been doing all along in monitoring what your needs are, what the cost of achieving your next milestone is going to be. Really knowing what you need, translating that into raising what you need, I think is very important. At this stage, you don't want to be raising more than you need. And you really should be kind of calibrating what that raise is to what you think that you need to get to that next milestone. And that doesn't mean just, hey, we want to have this out in the next month, so we're looking for a little bit of funding to help get to that. You want to try to find the right balance in terms of what that milestone is, the amount that you're going to raise to fund that, and how long that is likely to last you. So if you have a milestone that is, say, 12 plus months out, that you can raise capital to be able to achieve that. And then if you do achieve that, that's going to position you well for the raise for the next milestone. That's kind of a good rule of thumb to apply. But as you're putting this together and setting your expectations for what you're going to raise, remember Murphy's Law, and if something can go wrong, it probably will. Leave yourself a little bit of a buffer because you don't want to end up finding yourself in a situation where kind of between milestones and some of those anticipated funding rounds, you find yourself strapped for cash, and that can put you in a very precarious situation. I'd also recommend that even at these early stages, you get your house in order. And what I mean by that is you want to have your executive summary nailed down. You want to have a deck pulled together. I know a couple weeks ago, we heard from Tim Cooley, who I think put together a great guide that's very helpful, the Pitch Deck book, which you can find, that I think walks you through the mechanics of putting that together in a very effective way. Start thinking about how you would be collecting relevant documents. It's not too early to set up a data room where you have some of that available, because if there is the right investor who comes along and approaches you and is ready to invest, you don't want to at that point have to take a couple weeks trying to pull this together, and really make sure that you get them what they need. You want to get them what they need when they need it. And so it also helps you in thinking about preparing yourself for interacting with investors. And lastly, on this point, it's important for you to understand some of the mechanics of what your cap table is likely to look at with a round of investment, what kind of dilution is going to be implied, what might be going into a valuation that you would be utilizing. Also thinking about what kind of terms might be offered. So again, this is something that you should be thinking about, but I wouldn't get too much into the weeds and really start obsessing over the minutia of what a particular term is going to be, or what down to the decimal point of what your dilution is likely to be, because as you go through the process, that's likely to evolve. When you're having these conversations, you're interacting with investors, you want to get to a point of decision making as quickly as possible. The most important guideline that I would offer in your interactions with potential investors is to be totally upfront and transparent. Investors are going to see through. If you are BSing them, they are going to find that, and they are going to effectively hold it against you. And so this is not to say that you want to treat your investors as therapists. If where you say, hey, I don't really feel like I know what I'm doing, is probably not the conversation that you want to have. But letting them know where you are in your raise, honestly, who is committed, how much is committed, where you feel that your time frame is in completing your raise happens to be, and the realities of exactly how you've gotten to the amount of what you're looking to raise. Be transparent, and that can be an interaction that really then helps to evolve the specifics around your raise. By buzz is for bees, what I mean is that you should be thinking, allow the product, the solution, the traction that it's having in the marketplace to be what generates buzz in your company. Don't get into playing the scarcity game of, hey, you better act now because this round is filling up and we've got a hard deadline, or X number of people have said that they're interested. Playing those games can really do yourself a disservice, because oftentimes you think you have an investor or a commitment in the bag until you find out the next day that you really don't. So again, don't try to play the scarcity game more than is absolutely necessary. And I like to keep the chief ego officer out of the room. And this is kind of twofold. One is, you definitely, while you know your company and your space better than anyone else, or you should, you don't want arrogance to come across. Having this opportunity to interface with investors is as much an opportunity for you to learn from some of their questions as it is for them to learn from you. And so keeping a certain level of humility in those conversations is important. It's also important because just keeping yourself in check about what the end objective is, which is sourcing the capital to allow your business to flourish, that's the important piece of it. Not something where you can go out and wear your funding round as a badge of honor, saying, I raised X number of dollars. That is really not the goal. And I think that those who approach it from that perspective are honestly playing the wrong game. You want more than a signed check or a wire deposit. Really look at the investors that you're interfacing with and try to find those where there is a good fit, a good alignment, but also where they can provide other resources. Can they help to advise you on your growth journey, what you do next with your business? Can they advise you? Can they help to introduce you to potential partners or possible clients? That's incredibly important, and oftentimes just as important as the amount of money that they are contributing to your business. And know who these investors are. Make sure that you have done your homework to understand what is their philosophy. What are some of the other companies that they have invested in? Are you at the same stage as those? What are their expectations, both for you when you're meeting with them, but also do they have expectations about what their capital, how it's going to be used to fund growth? You want to make sure that that is consistent with your operating philosophy and culture so that you don't end up with a potential conflict in how that capital is going to be used. And then just to kind of wrap this up and bring it home, when I really think about that external raise as providing rocket fuel that really allows you to scale and grow the business. And for many outside investors, their expectation is that's how it's going to be used. You want to make sure that at the time that you pursue it, you have crafted the company in a way and gotten to a stage where it's going to be able to be used as that rocket fuel. If the rocket is only half built, and that fuel is put in, you can really, that can be a situation where the company gets torn apart. You also want to pursue this in a way that you get the funding done. Your job is to build the company. Funding is, whether you want to call it a necessary evil or just a necessary part of the business, you want to get back to your day job as quickly as possible. And your investors want you to get back to your day job as quickly as possible so that you can focus on building the business. When you're fundraising, you should be all in on that, but you want to get it wrapped up and concluded. And you want to then be able to have enough runway to apply that to you achieving your next milestone before you have to go through the distraction of pursuing the funding again. As you go through the process, every response that you get from investors deserves feedback and analysis, especially if they say no to you. It can be very painful when someone says they don't want to invest in your baby, but you should be reaching out to them and understanding why they didn't want to invest and how that can inform either the message, the way that you are structuring the business, or other facets of why they may not have pursued it. And lastly, just as a general philosophy, remember, this is not a zero-sum game where if you win, somebody else has to lose and vice versa. The whole point of being able to leverage funding and outside capital is so that you can make this a bigger enterprise and allow your idea and your business to flourish. If that happens, everyone who has invested, even if there is with rounds of investment dilution that's taking place, if you're able to expand the opportunity, this is where I channel one of my favorite George W. Bush misstatements of, we want to make the pie higher. And that is a win for everybody. If you give up some dilution to allow for the capital to come in, that's really going to allow the business to expand many-fold, that's going to be a win for everybody. And that's really the outcome that you're looking for. So I'm going to wrap up there. I'm sorry I went a little bit long. Really eager to take your questions. Here's my contact information. I think that this presentation will be available. Please don't hesitate to reach out. I love connecting with people, so feel free to connect any way that is convenient for you. And with that, let's get into some questions. All right, looking at Jeff is asking how to incorporate intellectual property into this in influencing valuations and fundraising. It's a great question, Jeff, and I definitely agree with. I'm sorry?
Awesome. I think there were.
Taylor, do you want to lead us through the questions?
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me?
You're breaking up a little bit. So maybe,
Parker, do you mind going through the questions in the chat if I'm breaking up? Sorry about that, Pete.
no worries.
No, you're good. Yeah, Pete, I think you're good to kind of how you're going, go through the questions and
Okay.
respond. Thanks.
Yeah, so Jeff, your question on intellectual property, I definitely think it's a very critical component of kind of having the business at a stage where you're ready to get in front of investors. I know for myself, I think that that is a very critical piece of what is contained in, certainly in your deck, in the value proposition that you have. And I think that being able to articulate that, it's almost a situation where not articulating that and spelling that out, I view as a red flag for the business. You know that it's going to come up. So the more that you can be proactive, and it doesn't mean that you need to have an ironclad IP portfolio from day one. That's rarely the case. But I think what I'm looking for and what many investors are looking for is you've thought through it. You understand that that is going to be an important component of differentiating your solution. And it certainly can influence the valuation when you get to that. And that's part of, we didn't spend a lot of time on the factors that go into valuation because there are so many, and it is as much of an art as it is a science. But the more that you are able to demonstrate that you have an intellectual property roadmap and material that can is likely to be able to stand on its own as IP, that's only going to enhance your valuation potential. Taylor's question, what are the financial assumptions in a forecast that investors will immediately look to as a gut check of reality? I think in the forecast, certainly an important part of that is understanding the cost side of it. That's something where I think that I find that many times in presentations, that piece of it is more, I would say, more of an afterthought. And so spending time on being able to demonstrate that you understand what the costs are going to be as you scale the business, which then will tie into the ask that you have in the raise, and being able to spell that out. Here's how that is going to be applied to satisfying those expense needs, I think can be a differentiator. There's a lot of debate around the revenue side of it. And I think it's one that you want to make sure that your forecast is tied into what you have laid out in terms of your the size of your market opportunity. The two should not be disconnected. You want to have, certainly you want to be showing progression up and to the right. That's kind of expected. You don't need to go out terribly far. But what it allows you to do in those forecasts is for you to demonstrate that you understand how, as the variables of your business, whether it is subscribers, whether it is new partners that are helping to provide distribution come on, the leverage that that's going to give you in driving the revenue. I think that that's important. What you do not want to do is what I had from one company that pitched to me. We got to the revenue projection slide of their deck, and they said, well, we know really all you want to see is that it goes up and to the right. And they had this rainbow colored arrow that was shooting into the stratosphere with a cartoon image of a unicorn next to it. So it was in such a just non-informative and flip way. Needless to say, that was the last meeting that we had with that company. Maxwell asks, any hot takes on fighting the imposter syndrome that can arise as you present yourself as an expert in your business and industry? Great question, and it is always a fine line. What you need to do, what I think really helps in that is you do understand the business more than those who are on the other side of the table. And I think that that is something that should be empowering that allows you to get into these conversations with a good middle ground. You're not going into these meetings with investors purely as a supplicant. And that's part of the reason why kind of that initial nest egg and bootstrap effort really helps you to provide a foundation where you're not desperate for capital, that you don't need to assume the role of a supplicant. But you don't want to be arrogant, but you still want to be able to be confident in those meetings. And if you are at a point where you feel that, hey, I don't really know what I'm talking about, I don't understand the business or the competitive landscape or my differentiation the way that I should, that I'm intimidated by getting in front of these investors, that might actually be an indication that, hey, there's more homework that needs to be done before getting out there and having some of these conversations. So it can be a bit of a gut check. Taylor asks, other than skin in the game, how do you decide where to spend the first precious funding? Should I pay for acquiring customers or filing a patent or developing the product further? Boy, that's truly an it depends situation. I think that for me, something that provides validation of the solution and of the product that you are offering, I think is some of the best early money that is spent, because that is going to help enable you to drive that additional funding once you start looking outside. You may have a great engineering team that you've put together. You may have secured that intellectual property, but if you haven't been able to generate any traction in the product or the solution, it's going to be very difficult to get anyone to fund you once you start looking outside. So I think the more that you can help to cultivate that validation, the more success you're going to have with utilizing that early capital. Casey asks, do you have a reference for how to determine a fair amount of equity to give out? Casey, maybe just for clarification, is that looking at equity split among the founders? Is that equity to early stage team? Or are you thinking about how much equity is going to be given effectively, quote unquote, given to an investor in some of these early rounds?
I mean, I guess in context, this would be more for the investment side. Like, how much is a good amount of a company equity pool to, hold aside for investment? Is there any recommendations on that, or how do you figure that out? Other than it seems like a little bit of smoke and mirrors there when I've had discussions.
Yeah, I would say that the general rule of thumb on that is, in thinking about each successive round, kind of be prepared and sort of target that it would be on order of 20% of the company that gets that is given to the investors in a given round. At a very early stage, it may be a bit less than that. So, you could be thinking it's sort of closer to the 15-ish end of that, and maybe in a later round it could end up being a little bit in excess of that. I think in general, you don't want to be attracting investors or raising capital at a level where in a given round you are giving up more than 25% of the equity. And so the balance of it is in figuring out, and that's why going through and determining the different milestones and what it's going to take to get there, to help give you a sense as to, on the journey to profitability and being self-sustaining, how many rounds are you going to need, helps to determine kind of what that ultimate dilution is going to be. If you end up giving too much to investors in an early round, that obviously is diluting you as a founder. And what you're going to need to make sure is that if you've given a lot to investors in exchange for an early funding round, then future investors may say, you know what, if we're investing at, even at that level, if it's 20% of the company in a future round, wow, we're going to have diluted the founders down to a level that we start to worry, are we going to be able to keep them actively engaged? And that's where your investors, who obviously they want to have their claim on the company for the capital that they're providing, but they share the interest in, they want you as the founders and as the captains of the ship to be able to stay with it and not jeopardize their investment by feeling that you've given out too much. So I would say kind of be thinking in that ballpark of around 20% for a given round.
Cool. Thanks a lot for that.
Yeah. Maxwell asks, at a high level, how would you break up a cap table? What would you think of the pie slices at the earliest stage? You know, I would say at a very high level, and this is another area where it's going to somewhat depend on the individual structure. You know, setting up the easiest path is an equitable split, even split among the co-founders, unless there is something where it's somebody is bringing all of the IP. It's something that you should agree based on what people are bringing to the table, what their level of commitment is. But the general rule of thumb would be, you know, it's an even split among the founders, and then maybe you set aside 10% of your equity as a pool for employees. That will likely increase over time. It's a good likelihood that in future rounds, investors will ask you to utilize part of your equity to maybe top up or increase that equity pool that is available as you continue to grow. But by setting that out there early, you're demonstrating that you're thinking about your employees, the team that is in the process of being built. And you're demonstrating that you're not getting into that situation of kind of squabbling of who's going to fund the employee equity grants. Spencer asks, what suggestions do you have for giving equity out for bootstrapping and keeping it for investors? In your experience, do you see more Delaware C Corps or just LLCs? Spencer, would you maybe just chime in on that in terms of when you say giving equity out for bootstrapping and keeping it for investors, are you thinking about kind of how much dilution is happening at that stage?
Yeah, but I think you covered a lot of it in some of your other comments. So just basically how much do you keep for bootstrapping, but I think you've covered it mostly. So. Okay.
Casey says, I've heard that on, yeah.
This is Taylor. Typically will finish up right now.
Okay.
Finish up right now, but if people still have questions and you're going through them and having you wrap on this, if that's okay.
Yeah, I certainly accept if folks have got other commitments, feel free to hop off. I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes if anyone would like, and to go through some of the remaining questions.
If you can keep going, that would be great. Pete, thanks.
Sure.
No, my pleasure.
Pete, as far as the Delaware Cs and the LLCs, what do you usually see and what do investors like to see?
By the time that you are, you can certainly convert from an LLC into a C Corp by the time that you start getting into some of your subsequent rounds. It's not something where necessarily you need to do that right off the bat. I feel that in general, you know, a path of least resistance might be setting up an LLC and then looking to transfer that as you achieve some of your milestones and move into some more advanced funding rounds. But again, that's an area where there's a little bit of leeway and you know, a number of different pros and cons on some of that initial structure. But I think in many cases, it's it's easy to start with a path of least resistance rather than spending too much time and money on setting up a more comprehensive or advanced structure than what you need. Casey asks, I've heard that finding the right funding takes 6 months, or do you agree with that expected timeline? I would say it's probably the rule of thumb on that is that it's going to take longer than you would like or hope for. It can be a lengthy process, and in many cases, you've got to kiss a lot of frogs before you find that right investor or combination of investors. And that's where I think that doing some of that homework and setting that foundation of having your ducks in a row before you start that engagement process can really help to facilitate some of those meetings. And I think that relationship building, again, on a very selective basis, you don't want to end up spending all of your time or half of your time or any appreciable amount of time spending talking with investors when you're not raising, but having a few that you are strategically building relationships with, so that as you move into a funding round, they can say, hey, I've known Casey for X number of years or months, and I've seen that he's delivered on what he has said he's going to do. That gives me more confidence in being willing to invest and might help to shorten that time period. But I think 6 months in terms of kind of from start to finish, you should certainly allow at least that amount of time, just because you never know what situation you're going to be in. None of us knew that COVID was happening. We don't know what other shocks to the economy or what is happening competitively in our space that is happening. You want to allow some of that time, again, to not put yourself in the situation where you find yourself in a cash crunch.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just thinking in relation to your comment about getting back to your day job, just kind of how to set that up for a good expectation.
Yeah, I mean, I would allow for that. You never fully know exactly what it's going to be. And sometimes you can set a target for what that's going to be, but setting an arbitrary deadline can go both ways. On the one hand, you can say, hey, this is the amount of time that I have to focus on this, and I got to get back to work. But if the funding hasn't come in by then, you can find yourself in a situation where your publicly announced deadline of when the funding round is going to close, what if you're only halfway full? That doesn't put you in a very good situation, and it might make things more difficult for the next round of raising. You just want to leave a little bit of flexibility there so that you don't paint yourself into a corner, and that kind of gets into that. You want to be able to get back, and that's why when you do go into a fundraising mode, you want to be all in on that as much as possible, so that you're not it doesn't drag on longer than is necessary, and you're not trying to juggle too many things, because it is a distraction. But in many cases, if you don't get that funding, it's not going to allow you to get to the next level of the business. So you kind of need to work with a little bit of the environment that you're in and the way that those conversations are progressing. Maxwell asks, can you explore the concept of lead investors? Do you need that first? Are they always needed? It's helpful. It's helpful, but I wouldn't say that it is critical. Certainly in the early stages, when you're looking at a seed round or an angel round, it's less important that there is someone who is the flag planted lead. It gets a little bit more useful in subsequent rounds. But if you have too many investors who are not willing to be the first to go, or are not willing to go until they see someone else who has kind of assumed that leadership role, it could be something that causes you to say, like, I need to evaluate why people are not willing to commit unless somebody else has demonstrated that they're willing to go first. And so in getting that feedback, that might be something that to me would be a little bit of a key into, hey, maybe there's something going on. People like it if there's a lead, but I wouldn't say that it's a must have. Cynthia asks, why do you think other people recommend holding on to as much equity as possible? Cynthia, are you asking in terms of founders wanting to hold on to as much as possible?
Well, I attended like a fundraising conference, and the impression that I got there was try to avoid investors as much as you can, because I think the statement that scared me is it's worse than getting married because it's easier to get out of a marriage. And so I thought, oh, is it like, I see investing as like a necessary evil. It's like, okay, only get into it if you're willing to get into the bed with the devil. So it scared me a little bit. But I'm like, as I'm understanding what you're saying, the mindset is kind of shifting for me. So.
Yeah, it is the bargain. And that's kind of what I was getting at, and just making sure that you understand that none of this money is free money. There are always strings that are attached, and whether that is dilution that you are taking, whether that is some influence and decision making that you're giving up. But that is something that I think at the right time, and if you have done all that you can to be lean, to be efficient and effective in setting up your structure, and getting your company as close to self-sustainability as you possibly can, that ties into the concept of using this outside capital as your rocket fuel. So you want to, as much as possible, build that base that then when you are feeling like, hey, we have a foundation, we've built the launch pad, and now we can really pursue scale. That is a time when you should be thinking like, I'm excited to take on some of this outside capital, because that's going to allow us to achieve a level of growth and success that we would not be able to do without it. And so doing it before you've built that rocket ship can be disastrous, and it can lead to very different sets of expectations about how you're going to progress. But the flip side of that is when you are ready to scale, it's very hard to do that. And it's only a very limited subset of businesses that are able to do that without taking in outside capital. So I think it's more about just making sure that you're doing that at the appropriate timing.
Great, thank you so much.
So I know we're up on the hour. It looks like we have covered the questions in the chat room. If anyone else has anything else, feel free to throw it out. Otherwise, I'll thank you guys for the opportunity. It was great to connect with everyone, and I really appreciate all of the great questions.
Thank you so much, Pete. Taylor, I had to hop off, his service is bad, but we really appreciate you presenting for us. That was awesome.
My pleasure. Thanks, everyone. See you next week.
Really good. Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, Pete.